Please, someone's in my house. He's in my bedroom. He's got a gun. He says he worships the devil. Cut to silence. Long pause. You can hear the panic in that voice. You can feel the ordinary house, the light bulb over the kitchen table, the family photos on the wall, being split open by something unimaginable. I'm Mara Ellison. This is Still Unanswered. Tonight, we return to one of those crimes that reshaped a city's nights and left a permanent stain on late 20th century American fear. Richard Ramirez, the man the papers called the Night Stalker. We'll trace his childhood, the crimes we know he committed, the ones he may have committed, and the gaps that still sit like open wounds in the official record. We'll talk about what his capture looked like, not a cinematic raid, but a neighborhood that finally fought back. And we'll interrogate the parts of the story that never quite add up: motive, meaning, and whether anything can really explain what he did. I'm joined by Dr. Isaiah Kwan, forensic psychologist and lecturer in criminology. Isaiah, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Mara. I'm glad to have the chance to talk through this case with the kind of care it needs.
Let's start the way we always do, with what's often left out when we meet a name like Richard Ramirez. We get the lurid images, courtroom pentagrams, magazine covers, but the biography behind the myth is messy and smaller and, frankly, more frightening in its ordinariness. Born Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez in El Paso, Texas, 1960, youngest of 5, father of volatile alcoholic, Catholic home, and critical to a lot of what follows, documented head injuries before age 6, and, perhaps most important, a cousin named Miguel, or Mike, who came back from Vietnam and introduced young Richard to images and stories of extreme sexual violence. Isaiah, how do we hold together these facts without turning them into a tidy cause and effect?
That's one of the central tensions in forensic work, Mara. We have risk factors: early brain injury, exposure to violence, neglect, substance use, and those factors raise probabilities but don't determine outcomes. When you read about the near-fatal head injuries and the development of temporal lobe epilepsy, for example, those can change impulse control, emotional regulation, and sensitivity to aggression. But most kids with those injuries don't become murderers. So the question is not whether these things made him in a single causal line, but how they combined with his environment, the modeling from an older cousin who glorified rape and killing, and his own choices over time.
Right. Made versus chosen. The psychologist Michael Stone described Ramirez as a made psychopath, shaped largely by trauma. That's a useful frame, but it's also politically fraught. People ask, are we excusing him if we talk about trauma? How do you address that?
We address it head on. Explanation is not exculpation. What helps us in treatment or prevention, early intervention, therapy, stable placements, are the same facts that help explain why someone may have been pushed toward violence. But recognizing risk factors doesn't erase moral agency. Ramirez repeatedly engaged in crimes as a teenager: burglary, sexual offending, using a master key at a Holiday Inn. There were opportunities where the system could have intervened more decisively. So the conversation is twofold: understanding pathways while holding him fully responsible for choices he continued to make.
And those early actions, the hotel molestation, theft, the disemboweling of animals in the desert, they show a pattern long before the murders. He even used a master key at work. It's chilling. One of the still unanswered angles we keep coming back to is why did systems fail to connect these dots, or in some cases, even fail to prosecute? For example, at the Holiday Inn, he was beaten by a husband, but charges were dropped because the couple wouldn't testify.
Exactly. And that's not unique to Ramirez. Victim reluctance, prosecutorial resources, prioritization of cases, these are systemic problems that mean proto-offending behavior can go unpunished or unaddressed. When those behaviors escalate, investigators later look back and say, why didn't we see it? But there's rarely one missed moment. It's a cascade of missed chances.
Let's move to the escalation. Ramirez leaves El Paso, drifts into California in the early 1980s, moves between LA and the Bay Area, and his criminality grows more sophisticated. Theft, burglary, then violently sexualized home invasions. There's a fascinating early link that isn't widely remembered. In 2009, DNA linked him to the 1984 killing of 9-year-old Mei Lung in San Francisco. That suggests his first murder may have been earlier and in a different city than the narrative that starts in LA in June 1984. Isaiah, why does that matter?
It matters because timelines shape our understanding of escalation and opportunity. If his first known murder is in April 1984 in San Francisco, then he had crossed a threshold earlier than investigators thought at the time. It also raises the possibility of other early victims that never had DNA confirmed. Cold cases can be misattributed or simply left unexamined. From a profiling standpoint, establishing the true start date changes hypotheses about heat maps, mobility, and victimology.
And it also complicates the comforting narrative that he went bad in Los Angeles alone. His predatory geography crosses jurisdictional lines, which overwhelmed investigators in the mid-'80s. That's part of why we later saw the Nights of Panic across 2 large metropolitan regions.
Yes, multi-jurisdiction is a technical nightmare, even today. Back then, data sharing was slower. Ballistics matched in some cases. The Avia shoe print was a crucial unifier. But detectives in LA and San Francisco were each dealing with local panic and a killer who deliberately blurred the lines.
Let's walk through the 1985 spree in a way that preserves victims' humanity while explaining the MO. Ramirez wasn't a tidy serial killer with a single victim profile. He targeted men, women, children, elderly couples, random in surface terms. But there were patterns: nighttime home invasions, entry through open windows or doors, targeting whoever was inside, extreme sexual violence, sometimes overkill. He asked victims to swear on Satan that they'd told him where things were. There were pentagrams left at scenes or phrased threats invoking Satan. But Isaiah, how do we interpret the Satanism? Sincere belief, theatrical intimidation, media performance?
It's probably all three, Mara. Some of Ramirez's actions, the pentagram on the palm in court, the repeated satanic references, appear performative, a way to frighten victims and cultivate an identity. But we also can't fully rule out that he held a genuine belief system of some kind. Perhaps a chaotic mix of misread occult symbolism and self-mythologizing. For clinicians, the core thing is whether these beliefs were delusional or purposeful. Most evidence points toward purposeful adoption, strategic, attention-seeking, and identity-forming, rather than primary psychosis.
So Satanism was, in part, his brand. And it worked. The media amplified that brand. The Night Stalker label arrived, and the public terror followed. People nailing windows, sleeping with lights on, buying locks and guns. The randomness of victims fed the fear. Your neighbor could die in their bed. He struck in places like Glassell Park, Rosemead, Whittier, Arcadia, Monterey Park, San Francisco, dozens of attacks across months. I want to tell two short survivor stories because they explain both the luck and the cruelty involved. First, Maria Hernandez, March 17, 1985, in Rosemead. She was attacked in her garage. Ramirez shot at her, but hit her keys and hand instead. She survived by feigning death, playing dead while he searched and left. Minutes earlier, he had killed Dale Okazaki. Maria's play for survival was precise, almost clinical. It shows how small choices can mean life or death.
And the second?
Maxine Zazzara, March 27, 1985, Monterey Park. The scene there is one of the most grotesque. Vincent Zazzara was shot in his sleep. Maxine was bound, stabbed, and mutilated, her eyes gouged and placed in a jewelry box. Investigators found an obvious shoe print at that scene that later linked to other attacks. This case shows both the animal cruelty and the symbolic mutilation, trophy-taking or ritualized domination, again blended with sexual violence.
That level of overkill is often associated with a desire to assert absolute control and to obliterate the victim's personhood. The removal or display of body parts can be trophy behavior, but in Ramirez's case, it's mixed with sexual sadism and a performative element, the pentagram language, the saying the Night Stalker was here. He wanted to terrify communities, and he wanted to feed his fantasies.
I want to pause here and say, we're not telling these details for shock. We're telling them because the brutality shows why the case has been so hard to contain in memory. Also, and this matters, Ramirez's victim set was diverse. That diversity confused initial profiling efforts and added to the sense that he could be anyone.
Right. When victims vary in age, gender, and race, profiling can't rely solely on victimology. You must lean more on forensic clues, shoe prints, ballistic matches, entry patterns, and surviving eyewitnesses. In this case, a survivor, Inez Erickson in August 1985, provided a detailed description of Ramirez and his car and a partial plate. That, combined with latent prints on a stolen Toyota, created the break investigators needed.
Which brings us to the investigation and the capture. The public release of Ramirez's name on August 30, 1985, made his face ubiquitous. Then, unbelievably, Ramirez returned to L.A. the next day and walked into a convenience store in East L.A. Elderly Hispanic women recognized him from La Opinion. What followed is a scene we rarely center in narratives. It wasn't an elite tactical team who took him down. It was neighbors. People chased him, beat him with a fence post, held him until police arrived. That capture says a lot about community response. Isaiah, how do you see that moment?
It's a critical corrective to the heroic detective trope. Communities living under threat make their own decisions when institutions seem overwhelmed. The Boyle Heights capture highlights civic courage and, frankly, the desperation people felt. It also complicates myth. The killer wasn't finally felled by forensic genius. He was stopped because ordinary people recognized the face of danger and acted, imperfectly but effectively.
There's a hypothetical that often circulates. What if the mob had killed him? Much of our knowledge about his interior life, letters, interviews, the eventual trial, would never have existed, and many unresolved links would remain closed. Do you think there's a moral calculus to that thought?
It's a painful what if. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, lethal vigilantism often removes chances for discovery and closure, but it also prevents further harm. We usually argue for due process because it offers truth, documentation, and legal accountability. But I also understand the visceral desire for immediate justice when communities feel abandoned. Ethically, our system errs on the side of institutional restraint, even when that feels unsatisfying.
And then the trial. Ramirez transformed court into stage. He flashed a pentagram on his palm. He smirked. He had admirers in the gallery, women who were fascinated, even sexually attracted to him. He was convicted in 1989 on 43 counts and sentenced to death. In the courtroom, the spectacle became part of the record. Isaiah, from a psychologist's lens, what does such theatricality tell you?
It signals several things: performative narcissism, a need to control public narrative, and an exploitation of media attention to maintain power. For some offenders, court becomes a platform to continue offending symbolically. Displaying the pentagram and making devil horn gestures is not new. It's a way to project fear, to be feared, and to be idolized by a certain subset. It also complicates victim impact. The defendant steals the spotlight from those hurt by his acts.
And the media played along. Intense coverage, the Night Stalker moniker, even music and band associations like AC/DC being pulled into the narrative. That media amplification raises a still unanswered question for us. To what extent does mass coverage of a killer feed the kind of attention he craves? And how do contemporary producers avoid resuscitating that appetite?
We have to be deliberate. Responsible true crime centers victims, avoids gratuitous glorification, and resists repeating the killer's dramatic slogans. But there's also a public safety element. Accurate reporting can help capture criminals. The line is narrow. In Ramirez's case, sensationalism certainly fed his image and likely fueled fan behavior. But the press also mobilized recognition that helped his capture when his photo circulated widely.
Now, the trial resulted in a death sentence, yet Ramirez died in 2013 from complications of B-cell lymphoma in a hospital after decades on death row. He never showed remorse publicly, and in prison he courted correspondence, married a woman who believed in his innocence, and drew disturbing artwork. Why do you think he maintained this lack of remorse even near the end?
For many psychopathic or narcissistic individuals, remorse is an alien feeling. They may confess to certain acts for attention or to manipulate, but deep empathy and guilt are absent. Ramirez's correspondence, asking for bikini photos, boasting, reflects a continuing focus on self-gratification rather than reflection. His marriage to Doreen Leoy and other admirers points to how notoriety can be a drug. It supplied adoration and a sense of control, possibly replacing any authentic interpersonal connection.
That admirer phenomenon itself is an unanswered social puzzle. What draws people, particularly women, to sympathetic or romantic fantasies about violent men? There's a long list: eroticization of danger, desire to save or tame a monster, attraction to fame. But the ethical hazard for us, the storytellers, is when we feed those narratives. We have to be careful.
Yes, and it's not uniform. Some correspondents are driven by curiosity, some by pathological attachment styles, some by the manipulation of the offender. Clinically, we see a mixture: traumatic attachment, hybridity of fantasy and reality, and sometimes strategic attempts to gain status through proximity to infamy.
Let's bring up some of the still unresolved investigative questions that make this case fertile for still unanswered. 1. The full victim count. Ramirez claimed more than 20 in Jailhouse Boasts. DNA would later link him to Mei Lung in 2009. But how many cases between 1983 and 1985 remain possible matches? Do we have the forensic capability now to close those gaps?
Modern DNA techniques, including touch DNA and database cross-matching, offer more power than in the 1980s. Many jurisdictions have revisited cold cases with success, but those efforts require preserved evidence and funding. Evidence degradation, lost chain of custody, and limited prioritized resources can impede cold case work. In high-profile cases like Ramirez, there's appetite, but systemic capacity determines how many doors actually reopen.
2. Missed early interventions. If the Holiday Inn cases had resulted in sustained prosecution or institutionalization, could we have changed the arc? We'll never know, but it's a critical question because it's about prevention rather than retrospective fascination.
Right. Counterfactuals are slippery, but they're useful. They force us to examine systemic weaknesses. Early juvenile interventions, enforced consequences for sexual offending, mental health outreach after documented head injuries, these are public health responses that could reduce population risk. For Ramirez specifically, earlier incarceration for sexual assaults might have removed him from communities where he later escalated. We can't say definitively, but the possibility invites policy reflection.
3. The role of the media. Did the press help capture him more than it helped perpetuate his brand? And how would social media have changed the story?
It's both. The widely distributed photo in La Opinión directly contributed to his recognition in the East LA store. But sensational coverage amplified his myth. Social media would have intensified both effects. Immediate identity dissemination might have led to faster capture via crowdsourced tips. That's a plus. But the echo chamber and algorithmic amplification could have created a viral infamy that might have increased attempts at copycatting or more adoring fan cults. The balance would be precarious.
Finally, what about motive? Ramirez famously said, "I killed because I felt like killing." Or, to kill, it's as simple as that. As a clinician, do you accept to kill as a motive, or is that a refusal to explain?
Sometimes to kill is the most accurate short answer, reflecting a hedonic or power motive. The act itself is the reward. But humans generally have nested motives, sexual gratification tied to violence, dominance, humiliation, thrill-seeking, and identity formation. Ramirez's enjoyment of terror, his sexual arousal from brutality, the role-playing with satanic imagery, these together create a motive complex. Saying "I killed" is both honest at a surface level and evasive in terms of psychological layering.
Let's talk about myth and misattribution. People often conflate Ramirez with the original Night Stalker, the later identified Joseph D'Angelo. That confusion is instructive. Sensational nicknames can actually bury nuance and lead to public memory problems. How should we, as producers and consumers of true crime, correct that?
We should insist on precise naming and historical context. Nicknames are useful shorthand, but they can obfuscate. Adding geographical or chronological markers helps. Night Stalker, Ramirez, 1985, versus original Night Stalker / Golden State Killer, D'Angelo, 1970s-80s. Producers can also explain how labels mutated and the consequences of that mutation for victims' families and for public understanding.
Now, a harder topic, the death penalty. Ramirez was sentenced to die, but spent decades on death row before dying in hospital at 53. Some felt justice served, others felt robbed of execution. From a criminological and moral perspective, does the prolonged death row experience add anything to justice?
There are multiple axes here: retribution, deterrence, closure for victims' families, and practical considerations like the justice system's errors. Long delays negate much of any retributive satisfaction and can re-traumatize victims' families by prolonging publicity. Practically, the death penalty does not appear to deter more than life imprisonment. Many argue that prolonged appeals and the spectacle of death row may enhance the offender's notoriety, which seems counterproductive to victims' needs.
I want to name a case study in Missing Links. Patty Elaine Higgins. She was charged. Then the charges were dropped, a name that often disappears from retellings. This highlights the uneven patchwork of evidence linking certain murders to Ramirez. What can cold case teams do now to revisit suspects like Ramirez, even after his death?
Cold case teams can re-examine preserved biological samples with modern DNA tech, re-evaluate ballistic and footwear evidence using updated databases, and cross-compare timelines with Ramirez's known locations. They can also digitize and re-interview surviving witnesses with fresh methodologies. Legal consultation is necessary for transfer or use of evidence, especially across jurisdictions. It's time-consuming and costly, but it's where closure often comes from.
You mentioned re-interviewing witnesses. In my reporting, I'm always struck by how memory is both stubborn and fragile. Survivors' memories are invaluable for investigation, but also shaped by trauma. How do investigators balance respect for survivors while seeking reliable testimony years later?
With extraordinary care, trauma-informed interviewing avoids re-traumatization and recognizes memory gaps as data rather than signs of deceit. Cognitive interview techniques help reconstruct sensory cues and context. Prosecutors should never coerce or suggest, and investigators should triangulate survivor testimony with physical evidence wherever possible. It's a delicate balance of compassion and rigor.
We've spoken a lot about Ramirez the man and Ramirez the myth. I want to close with two uncomfortable reflections and then give you, Isaiah, time for final remarks. First, there are still people, online communities, some music references, a handful of admirers who romanticize him. That admiration is part of the harm. It re-victimizes families by turning a murderer into a cultural object. Second, despite all the data, there's an interior life of Ramirez that will forever be unreadable. Letters and performances aren't the same as lived remorse. We must accept some limits in our knowing. Isaiah, final thoughts on how to responsibly study and talk about someone like Ramirez.
We should maintain a victims-first ethic and a humility about our conclusions. Use science to illuminate behavior, but not to absolve. When discussing causes, emphasize prevention, better head injury care, trauma services, juvenile intervention, and be very cautious about sensational detail. The goal is not to feed a celebrity around a killer, but to extract lessons, support survivors, and close cold cases where possible. Lastly, accept that some aspects of inner life will remain unknown, and that uncertainty should make us careful, not more curious for the wrong reasons.
Before we end, I want to read a short passage from a survivor statement that stuck with me. It's from Inez Erickson, who survived an attack in Mission Viejo in August 1985. She wrote, "There are nights that the house is quiet and I hear the noises of what he left behind. Fear. I still keep the light on for my daughter. Those domestic traces, the leaving on of a lamp, the checking of a window, those are the real legacies of Ramirez's spree. Not the courtroom theatrics, but the everyday fear. For listeners who want to do something Support organizations that assist survivors of sexual violence and violent crime. Donate to local cold case units if your city has them, and insist on journalism that centers victims and resists sensationalism.
And if you're interested in the criminological side, read academic reviews on temporal lobe injury and violent behavior, but keep a critical mind. Correlation is not causation. Advocate for funding for early childhood intervention as a public health measure. It's not glamorous, but it prevents more harm.
We'll include sources and reading recommendations in the episode notes, the Britannica entry on Ramirez, court decisions, and contemporary reporting from the LA Times and San Francisco Chronicle, among others. We drew heavily on case files and archival material in preparing this episode. One last, still unanswered question I'll leave listeners with. Was there ever a point where Ramirez could have fully told us why he became who he was? And would we have believed it? He gave us fragments, boasts, and lies. But maybe the real unreadable thing is that the answer, if it exists cleanly, would be proverbially ordinary, a concatenation of abuse, neglect, opportunity, and a choice. Maybe that's a scarier truth than any single demonic confession.
And there's a moral onus in that observation, to act on the ordinary causes. Prevention is less cinematic, but more humane.
Isaiah, thank you for joining me, for keeping the analysis rigorous and the compassion present. To our listeners, thank you for holding this with care. This was Still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Isaiah, where can listeners find more of your work?
You can find some of my articles and lectures at the university site. Just search Isaiah Kwan Criminology or on my research page. I also lecture occasionally on trauma and violence prevention. Thanks, Mara.
If you have information about any cold cases that may connect to this episode, please contact the relevant law enforcement cold case unit. We'll include links in the show notes. And if this episode brought up anything difficult for you personally, please seek support. Your local crisis lines and sexual assault centers are there for you. Next week on Still Unanswered, we'll turn to another case where jurisdictional confusion cost precious time, and we'll ask whether modern technology can still stitch together what decades ago was frayed. Subscribe if you want that conversation. Good night.